This video will focus on another element of a lesson plan, which is the learning outcomes. When we talk about learning outcomes, we are talking about the statements that specify what learners will be able to do as a result of a learning activity. Outcomes are usually expressed as knowledge, skills, or attitudes. They specify the intended knowledge, skills, attitudes, or behaviors that learners are expected to achieve by the end of the lesson. Learning outcomes are broad in scope and encompass the overall goals of a learning experience. They provide a broad picture of what students should be able to achieve in terms of their learning, often encompassing multiple learning objectives. So many scholars spoke extensively about learning outcomes, such as Benjamin Bloom. His taxonomy is a widely recognized framework for classifying educational objectives. His definition for learning outcomes is focused on looking at them as observable and measurable behaviors that encompass 6 hierarchical levels: knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. These levels represent progressively more complex cognitive skills. Robert Mager also defined learning outcomes as statements that specify the desired performance or behavior that learners should exhibit at the end of the learning experience. They consist of 3 components: the behavior or performance, the conditions under which it should be demonstrated, and the criteria for acceptable performance. Ralph Taylor, who is known for his work on curriculum design, defined learning outcomes as statements that describe the specific knowledge, skills, and attitudes that learners should possess upon completion of a learning program. John Biggs introduced the concept of constructive alignment, emphasizing the alignment of intended learning outcomes, teaching and learning activities, and assessment methods. According to him, learning outcomes are statements that describe what learners will be able to do, think, or feel as a result of their learning experience. He highlighted the importance of focusing on desired student learning rather than just content coverage. Characteristics of effective learning outcomes are summarized in 5 main key points. Number 1, clear and specific. Clearly articulate what students should know and be able to do, while avoiding vague or general statements that make it difficult to determine whether the outcome has been achieved or not. Focus on thinking. When we talk about students thinking, then we need to make sure that the good learning outcomes describe the intellectual work that students will do. So we might need to ask ourselves the question, Does this outcome require students to have knowledge about the subject specific and use that subject in a certain way? What level of cognitive work does this outcome require? The third criteria, their mastery demonstration. Good learning outcomes are accessible, meaning that the teacher can design a fair and valid way to demonstrate students' mastery of every point related to that outcome. Once students have achieved this outcome, we need to ask ourselves, can we have a certain model or a certain way where students can demonstrate this knowledge to an outside evaluator, such as a parent or principal? The fourth point, which is measurable. We need to ensure that the learning outcome is measurable so that it can be assessed or observed. So we have to specify the criteria or evidence that will be used to determine whether the outcome has been met. Good learning outcomes are measurable, meaning that the teacher can design a certain way for students to demonstrate how well or to what degree they have achieved the objective. So, a good question to ask ourselves could be, what do I visualize a successful learner being able to do as a result of this lesson? Last but not least, focus on the learner. We need to focus on our cohort rather than explain what the instructor will do in the course. Good learning outcomes describe knowledge or skills that the student will employ, and it will help that specific cohort of students understand why the knowledge and the skills are useful and valuable to their personality, professional development, and academic future. As a summary, and I do call this the golden rule, learning outcomes, they should describe who is involved, what the learner will do, conditions learners will encounter, and describe how well performance is done. Looking into what the teacher will write in front of the learners is very important. Learning outcomes are often formulated using action verbs to describe observable and measurable behavior. They provide a clear description of what students should be able to do, understand, or apply as a result of their learning experience. These outcomes can encompass various domains of learning, including cognitive, meaning knowledge and intellectual skills, affective, meaning attitudes and values, and psychomotor, meaning physical skills and coordination. We can discuss so many different examples of learning outcomes for specific disciplines. But what we need to be focused on is the phrasing of the statement. So it has to be thought of through the lens of students will be able to. In science, students will be able to explain the process of photosynthesis and its role in plant growth. In mathematics, students will be able to solve system of equations and graph the corresponding lines. In language arts, students will be able to analyze the theme and provide textual evidence to support their interpretation, so on and so forth. Learning outcomes ensure that learning experiences are purposeful, focused, and measurable, leading to meaningful student achievement and growth. Let's look into the ABCD of writing learning outcomes. A stands for audience. We need to describe who is performing the behavior. And definitely, it is our learners, our students. B stands for behavior. We need to describe the visual performance. We need to talk about what is expected from a learner to do. It should be measurable. For example, writing a sentence, collecting data, describing. And here we need to be fully focused on what Bloom's taxonomy describe the different kinds of thinking that people do and how they use it. C, condition. The learning outcomes should describe what learners will use or have access to or not to be allowed to use. Describing real-world conditions which performance will occur. And last but not least, which is the degrees. Describing the measurement criteria can include the quality, accuracy, time, and speed.